China.
Trade between China and Africa.
Now, Africa's bilateral trade with China surged to a record high last year.
China has been Africa's top trading partner for 15 consecutive years.
That if there is only one word that can characterize our partnership with China, it is tangible results.
Exceeded $314 billion in the first 11 months of 2025. That's a 17.8% increase in just 1 year, already surpassing the total for all of 2024. In June 2025, China announced it would drop tariffs on imports from all 53 African countries it maintains diplomatic relations with. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi just visited Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, and Lesotho in January 2026, continuing a 36-year tradition of Chinese foreign ministers starting each year with an African tour. Meanwhile, Western influence across the continent is quietly collapsing, and Western governments are scrambling to figure out how to respond.
$1 trillion, that's what China is reporting as its trade surplus tonight with the United States. That is a first.
What makes this alarming for Western capitals isn't that China is outspending them or deploying military forces. China is doing something more effective. They're turning frustrated African governments away from Western partnerships through trade dominance, infrastructure delivery, and debt arrangements that don't come with political conditions. And they're doing it without any direct confrontation with Western powers. For decades, Western engagement with Africa followed a pretty consistent model. Aid came with conditions. Loans required governance reforms. Infrastructure projects moved slowly because they needed environmental assessments, transparency audits, and democratic oversight. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would lend money to African governments, but those governments had to commit to privatizing state assets, cutting social spending, and opening their markets to foreign competition. That model worked fine as long as African governments had no alternatives, but that model created deep frustration. Leaders watched their countries need roads, ports, and power plants urgently, while Western financing took years to materialize. They watched Western institutions demand electoral timelines and anti-corruption measures, while their populations needed infrastructure immediately. They watched Western aid agencies attach dozens of conditions to every dollar, while China showed up ready to build with no political strings attached. China recognized this frustration and moved decisively. Between 2000 and 2023, Chinese financial institutions loaned approximately $182 billion to African nations for development projects, primarily in infrastructure. They didn't demand democratic reforms. They didn't require privatization. They didn't threaten sanctions if countries delayed elections. They offered a straightforward transaction. We'll finance your infrastructure. You commit to repaying the loan. No lectures about governance. What China understood was that African governments weren't looking for partners who would tell them how to govern. They were looking for partners who would help them build what their countries needed. Chinese companies started arriving with equipment, workers, and timelines measured in years instead of decades. They built roads, railways, ports, and power plants, while Western feasibility studies were still being drafted. In the past 25 years, China has helped Africa build and upgrade nearly 100,000 kilometers of roads and more than 10,000 kilometers of railways. That's not promises or plans. That's actual infrastructure Africans are using right now. Ethiopia has Chinese-financed railway networks connecting cities. Tanzania has Chinese-built port expansions increasing trade capacity. Kenya has the standard gauge railway connecting Mombasa to Nairobi, built with a $3.6 billion loan from China's Export-Import Bank. China's strategy goes beyond just building infrastructure. They're integrating themselves into Africa's economic future. Over 7,500 African students were enrolled in Chinese universities in 2025. China opened 22 Russia House cultural centers across the continent by the end of 2025. They opened new embassies in Niger and South Sudan in 2025, with 5 more planned for Comoros, Gambia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Togo. Some of these countries never even had Soviet embassies during the Cold War, so China is building diplomatic infrastructure in places the Soviet Union never reached. But China's real breakthrough isn't infrastructure, it's how they handle trade. From January to November 2025, China-Africa trade exceeded $314 billion. China announced in June 2025 that it would grant zero-tariff access to exports from all 53 African countries with diplomatic relations. That means African products can enter the Chinese market at unprecedented speeds with no tariff barriers. For African exporters, that's transformative. Rwandan chili peppers, Ethiopian coffee beans, and Tanzanian cashews all gained wider access to Chinese markets in 2025 alone. China is also shifting from just building infrastructure to actually producing consumer goods in Africa for African markets. Chinese investments in Africa's resource-intensive sectors have declined by roughly 40% since their 2015 peak. Instead, Chinese companies are now flooding African markets with consumer products. Chinese entrepreneurs are relocating to Nigeria, Kenya, and other countries to sell everything from earphones and data cables to bubble tea, slippers, small appliances, furniture, and press-on nails. These aren't giant state-owned enterprises anymore. These are private Chinese business people targeting Africa's growing consumer market, and some are earning six-figure US dollar incomes in their first year. Chinese exports to Africa surged 28% year-over-year in the first 3 quarters of 2025, following a 57% increase from 2020 to 2024. Most of those products are higher-value, manufactured goods like electronics, plastics, and textiles. China is treating Africa as both a source of raw materials and a massive consumer market with growing purchasing power. Now, all of this growth has created a debt conversation that Western governments keep trying to frame as a crisis. Critics talk about debt trap diplomacy, warning that China uses loans to gain control over strategic assets. But the evidence doesn't support that narrative. A 2022 study found that African nations actually owe more to private Western creditors than to China. Approximately 35% of Africa's external debt is held by Western banks, asset managers, and oil traders. Only 12% is held by Chinese lenders. Here's where China's approach differs fundamentally from Western institutions. When African countries struggle to repay Chinese loans, China restructures them. Between 2001 and 2017, China restructured or waived loan payments for 51 debtor nations without seizing state assets. A 2025 assessment found that China prefers rescheduling by extending repayment periods rather than demanding principal reductions or interest rate changes. They avoid recognizing losses in their lending portfolio, and there's limited evidence of Chinese lenders agreeing to debt write-downs. That's different from how the IMF and World Bank operate. Western institutions demand comprehensive debt sustainability analyses, require countries to negotiate with all creditors simultaneously through frameworks like the Paris Club, and impose strict conditions on new lending. China negotiates bilaterally. They work directly with individual governments. They extend timelines when countries face trouble. They avoid the multilateral coordination that Western institutions insist on. This creates leverage that Western governments find alarming. When Zambia faced debt restructuring negotiations starting in 2020, China co-chaired the creditor committee alongside France. The process took years partly because China refused to accept the same terms as other creditors. China wanted bilateral negotiations. Western creditors wanted multilateral coordination. Eventually, they reached agreements, but China maintained its preference for bilateral arrangements that give them more direct influence over individual countries. Kenya and Ethiopia both recently converted portions of their Chinese loans from dollars to yuan. The yuan-denominated bonds, known as panda bonds, offered average yields of around 2.4% in 2025, roughly half the rate of comparable dollar debt. The IMF warned this introduces currency risk, but for Kenya and Ethiopia, it immediately reduced their debt service costs. Sri Lanka requested $500 million in yuan funding for a highway project originally priced in dollars. Hungary is preparing to issue 5 billion yuan in panda bonds. The yuan is being used in 30% of trade invoicing between China and Africa. Western governments are alarmed because this systematically erodes their leverage. For decades, Western countries had real leverage in Africa. If you wanted security assistance, you worked with the United States or European countries. If you needed development aid or budget support, you went to the IMF or World Bank. If you wanted international legitimacy, you you sought Western diplomatic recognition. That leverage allowed Western powers to shape political transitions, influence economic policies, and maintain partnerships even when relationships got tense. China's model breaks that system. Governments don't need Western security assistance because China and Russia provide alternatives. They don't need IMF loans because China offers resource-backed financing without governance requirements. They don't need Western diplomatic backing because China recognizes them regardless of how they came to power or how they govern. China doesn't have to replace Western influence entirely. Making it optional instead of necessary is enough. The sanctions system that Western governments rely on only works when target countries have limited alternatives. When Western governments impose sanctions, they're effective because most countries need access to Western markets and financial systems badly enough to comply. But if China offers an alternative pathway that bypasses Western systems entirely, sanctions lose their bite. Countries facing Western pressure can just deepen ties with China instead. Western responses have been remarkably limited. The United States, under the Trump administration, shows minimal interest in Africa. The 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy gave Africa less than a full page of attention. European countries face their own constraints. Ukraine consumes enormous political attention and military resources. European countries don't have the bandwidth to significantly increase African engagement, even if they wanted to. The institutional mechanisms that might coordinate Western responses are weakening. The G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, launched during COVID-19, has struggled to deliver timely results. 25 African countries were in debt distress or at high risk as of March 2025, up from 9 in 2012. The framework requires coordination between Paris Club countries and China, but China prefers bilateral negotiations. This creates delays that frustrate African governments and make Chinese lending more attractive by comparison. Western governments keep talking about offering alternatives, but they're not delivering at China's speed or scale. China committed to helping implement 30 infrastructure projects across Africa through their 2024 to 2027 action plan. They're building industrial parks, establishing manufacturing zones, creating logistics hubs, and training 60,000 Africans through vocational programs. They designated 2026 as the year of China-Africa people-to-people exchanges, launching cultural and educational programs across the continent. What Western governments struggle to accept is that African leaders are making calculated strategic decisions based on their own interests. They're not being coerced. They're not falling into traps. They're choosing partners who offer what they need without imposing what they don't want. For governments trying to industrialize quickly, that means infrastructure without decade-long approval processes. For resource-rich countries negotiating contracts, that means buyers who don't attach governance conditions. For countries frustrated with Western lectures about democracy, that means partners who acknowledge their sovereignty. Many African governments maintain relationships with Western countries, China, and others simultaneously. They're not abandoning the West. They're reducing dependency on any single partner. That's exactly what you'd expect from governments acting in their own interests. The problem for Western powers is that this diversification reduces their influence, whether they like it or not. There are basically 3 scenarios for where this heads over the next 5 years. In the first scenario, China consolidates its dominance. Trade between China and Africa exceeds $500 billion annually by 2030. Chinese infrastructure projects continue expanding, with Belt and Road Initiative investments driving growth across transport, energy, and digital sectors. The yuan becomes the preferred currency for 30 to 40% of China-Africa trade. Chinese consumer brands establish permanent market share across African countries. Manufacturing shifts increasingly to Africa as Chinese companies build production facilities, targeting local and regional markets. In the second scenario, China maintains steady engagement without explosive growth. Trade stays around $300 to $350 billion annually. Infrastructure projects continue, but at a slower pace due to Chinese economic constraints and reduced lending capacity. The yuan usage in trade invoicing stabilizes around 30%. Western countries partially re-engage through targeted partnerships in specific sectors like green energy or technology, creating some competitive balance. In the third scenario, China's economic problems force contraction. trade growth slows significantly as China's domestic economy struggles with overcapacity and demographic challenges. Chinese lending to Africa decreases substantially as Chinese financial institutions face pressure at home. Some African countries renegotiate or default on Chinese loans, creating friction. Western countries use this opening to rebuild relationships through conditional aid packages. But this scenario requires China facing severe economic crisis, which hasn't materialized. The most realistic outcome falls between the first and second scenarios. China will likely maintain its position as Africa's largest trading partner. Infrastructure cooperation will continue expanding in countries where Chinese companies already operate. Yuan usage in trade will gradually increase but face structural ceilings because of China's trade surplus with Africa and global reliance on the US dollar. Chinese consumer goods will keep flooding African markets as profit margins narrow in China and trade barriers rise in the West. Western influence won't disappear entirely. Many African countries will continue working with Western institutions on specific issues like health, education, and climate. But Western influence becomes one option among many instead of the default choice. That shift fundamentally changes how international relations work across the continent. China designated 2026 as the year of China-Africa people-to-people exchanges. Their Foreign Minister Wang Yi attended the launching ceremony at the African Union headquarters in January 2026. Over 50 African nations participated in the 2025 Russia-Africa Partnership Forum Conference. China is deepening institutional relationships that will outlast individual projects or political leaders. What Western governments are slowly realizing is that they're not competing for Africa's future. They're trying to maintain relevance in a competition that's already been decided in key sectors. China has become Africa's largest trading partner. Chinese infrastructure is already built and operating. Chinese consumer products are already in African markets. Chinese cultural centers are already training the next generation. The question isn't whether China will take the lead. The question is, what comes after China already has it? Geopolitical outcomes get decided in trade statistics that grow 17.8% year over year, in infrastructure that moves from plan to completion in years instead of decades, in debt arrangements that extend payment timelines instead of demanding governance reforms, in zero tariff access that opens markets instead of closing them. China's strategy in Africa won't be written about like World War II or the Cold War, but it's reshaping global economic power in ways that matter more than most military victories.